What's going on, Summoners? Welcome back to another ProGuides video. I'm Kangas, and as promised, I'm here with a full set of upcoming changes for patch 11.19. So for those of you who want a head start or are just curious about what's to come, look no further because this video will cover everything you need to know about the next patch. For the most part, we almost always see these changes make it through, but don't be surprised if there's some minor adjustments by the time the new patch is actually released. But with that said, hit the sub button and let's get right into it. So first things first, let's run through the skins. Worlds is just around the corner, and accordingly, an annual World skin will be released. Check out the skin shop next patch to find Jarvan sporting some new attire to represent the peak of the competitive season. We have some new dark and light skins coming up too, with Dawnbringer Morgana, Yone, and Vex, as well as Nightbringer Lilia, Tryndamere, and Kayn. And also Kayn Prestige will be available next cycle too. So check those skins out, they look amazing as always, but next up, let's run through the balance changes. Beginning with the top lane, Kennen is receiving a nerf after performing a little too well in both the top lane and mid lane. He's also a little too strong in competitive play, and this patch is another one targeted at balance for Worlds. Next patch, his Q is receiving a nerf and the damage is going down by 10, while the AP ratio will be reduced by 5%. This is a small damage nerf, but it adds up during long teamfights and especially during the laning phase. In terms of burst damage, it's not really a gigantic loss, but it'll definitely be enough to make a difference in many situations. Next is a buff for Aatrox, and this one kinda comes as a surprise, but meta diversity is nice and we can probably expect to see him picked during Worlds because of this. His W's cooldown early on will be reduced by 6 whole seconds, meaning that you can use it more liberally to either farm when playing passively or to aggressively trade more frequently. Since this ability is usually maxed last, it's actually a pretty big deal for Aatrox players, but we got lots of other buffs to cover as well in this video, so don't be surprised if overall there's big meta changes. And speaking of all those changes, there's no better time to contact a coach to talk about them. I can cover all this stuff in a video, but they can help you pinpoint exactly where there's gaps in your gameplay and let you take advantage of the fact that other players are also adjusting to the new meta. So check out ProGuides.com because we got lots of coaches that can help you specialize in whatever champion you want to main. Next up in top lane, we got Cho'Gath, who is also up for a pretty big buff. His Q's cooldown will be reduced by an entire second. This helps him out at all stages of the game. And given that he's only been played competitively 26 times this season across all regions, every little second counts. Gwen is also receiving a buff, but this one's kinda minor. With a little extra health regeneration, she'll have a slightly stronger laning phase with a little extra HP to work off of. Probably won't make a very big difference, but hey, even the smallest amount of health can make a big difference during competitive games. But she's not the only AP top laner getting buffed, because we also have a buff to Mordekaiser. This one's kinda similar to Aatrox's. His E's cooldown will be going down by 4 whole seconds. This is a gigantic early game buff that makes aggressive play much more forgiving. We're all human, even the pros, and once in a while you're gonna whiff, and that long cooldown was very punishing before. But again, you often max this last, so this is a pretty big buff. Next up is a buff for Poppy. Her passive's cooldown will be reduced at all stages of the game, and with a lower cooldown, she can potentially be much more oppressive as her windows of power will be more frequent. The lowered cooldown also means that she has access to ranged poke more frequently too, so kind of a quasi-ranged top laner now. Renekton went through a rough nerf this patch, and he's receiving a compensation buff to help him adjust next cycle. He's receiving buffs to his health, health for level, and most importantly, his W won't lock him out for as long. This will leave Renekton actionable faster and make the previous nerf that reduced his W stun duration a lot less impactful than before. Although the stun is still shorter than before, a flat health buff should be enough to help him have more presence in the early game and shut down opposing top laners. Finally, we have a small buff for Sion coming up. His W shield is going up by a straight 10. It's not a huge buff, but it'll definitely help out in the early game, and there will of course be cases where the shield manages to survive with just less than 10 HP left, so in those situations, this buff will be nice. The biggest impact of this buff is that he'll either win trades by 10 more HP or lose them by 10 less than before. Over the course of the laning phase, this can add up, and Sion will thus be much more reliable and safe as a pick than before. Next up, let's run through the jungle. In the jungle, the first buff we have is for Gragas. His W's AP ratio is going up by 10%. Gragas is underperforming in solo queue, and this buff should help both solo queue and competitive players. We've seen AP Gragas destroy his competition on the world stage, and this buff should help him possibly make an explosive return. Qiyana received some changes last patch, but they weren't really enough to make her a competent jungler yet. 11.19 is round 2 for Qiyana jungle buffs, as her Q monster damage is going up and her Q plus E combo will be more forgiving at shorter range. A lot of Qiyana mains have been complaining about running into major issues with her on the current patch, and this upcoming patch should help address those. Finally, Sejuani is receiving a buff as well on this next patch, because it couldn't be a Worlds without Sejuani buffs. With a variety of tanks receiving buffs, we'll likely see more of them competitively and in our own solo queue games. This season has had its ups and downs for tanks, but Riot is no longer looking at the items and is now fine-tuning individual champions at this point, so they'll probably be close to meeting their mark. Anyway, Sejuani's Q cooldown is down early, and damage is going up by 10 next patch. So that covers the jungle, let's jump to the mid lane next. Ryze has seen a lot of competitive play in spite of a low solo queue win rate. Again, this is a patch intended to adjust the game for competitive play specifically, so Ryze is unable to dodge these nerfs. His Q's AP ratio will be reduced and his E's cooldown is going up very slightly. These micro adjustments will probably have an effect on specific matchups and most importantly, his late game scaling. As a result, he'll be a less appealing pick, but I'm sure teams that value him will still lock him in during appropriate situations, just probably not blue oneable anymore. Akali has been underperforming as well, but because of how volatile she is to changes, she's only receiving a minor buff next patch. Her base health regen as well as health regen growth will be increased slightly to help her out during the lane phase. And moving from patch 11.17 to 11.18, Fizz's win rate dropped by about 2 percentage points. His recent adjustments were supposed to be an equal shift of power, but it was definitely a nerf, leaving him kind of out to dry. Next patch, his changes will be reverted, and his E's cooldown will also be lowered by 2 seconds once maxed. Funnily enough, this will actually leave him in a stronger place than before, reverting him and then buffing his E. With ability haste, that cooldown will get extremely low, making it even more difficult to catch the slippery menace. Now before moving on with the rest of the mid laners, we got our question of the day. Are there any champions that you really want to see at Worlds this year? While Samira was an absolute mess to balance upon release, I love watching pros pilot her, so I'm kind of holding out that it's a Samira meta, but let me know your answers in the comments down below. Next up, Galio is up for a really small buff this patch, but don't worry if this idea scares you, it's not a damage buff and won't become the one-shot nightmare that ruined everyone's sleep schedules. League already does that on its own. Nope, this buff is just his W's cooldown decreased with ability rank, which will just increase his utility in fights. Next up, Seraphine is receiving a pretty impactful buff to her ultimate. The cooldown will be reduced by 20 flat, enabling her to fight at full power more frequently. And Sylas is another champion who's also pretty sensitive to any balance adjustments. Riot wants to buff him, but has decided to give him a really small one to make sure that he doesn't get out of control. He's receiving more base mana and base mana regen. This is only really a buff in the early game, but it will help competitive players push in that last wave before their first recall. But the most anticipated change next patch is of course the newest champion, Vex. We have plenty of content covering her abilities, so make sure to check out our channel if you want more info on her, but Amumu's finally getting a friend, and that already makes her release pretty hype. So with the mid lane covered, let's run through the bot lane to wrap things up. First up, we only had one single marksman change, and that was for Varus. He received a nerf to combat his power in competitive play, but it wasn't enough. So next patch, his Q's cooldown will be increased by 2 seconds at max rank. He won't be able to poke nearly as frequently, and paired with his nerfs from this patch, he'll likely have less presence in competitive play, if not just dropped entirely. Sona has been killing it on Summoner's Rift since her rework, and it turns out part of the reason was that she had a couple of bugs that made her stronger than intended. First, her armor will be reduced by 2, but in addition to this, her Q will no longer hit enemies that Sona can't see, and her E-power cord won't ignore slow resistances. These were some major bugs that easily gave her more power than intended, but even with these nerfs, Sona will remain an incredible late game support pick. Soraka has also popped off recently because of the recent buff to her ultimate, which now purges healing reduction, making it way easier for her to save allies that have been singled out. The change also made her ultimate impactful outside of teamfights as well. When she casts it on an ally across a map, for example, it makes a bigger difference during those close fights. So with the ability so strong, it's receiving a slight nerf to healing next patch. But that's it for all the champion changes. With that said, we've concluded the upcoming changes for patch 11.19. Hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel, and also check out our community Discord through the link in the description down below. That's it for today, so best of luck on the Rift, everybody. Stay hydrated, and I'll see you in the next one.